Hi guys, my name is Jevin Torreson. My responsibility at LinkedIn is to help our clients develop, implement, and measure their talent marketing strategies. Back home in Chicago, I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son, both of whom are very into the television program Transformers. As I prepared for today and told them I would be in front of the camera, they asked if the Transformers would be part of the show. Well, characters such as Bumblebee and Chaser aren't here. I'm lucky enough to be joined by an incredibly skilled group of talent attraction stars who are Transformers in their own right. Through dynamic talent marketing strategies, they are helping to transform their organizations through the power of diversity to help build winning teams. Before we get into our panel, it's important that we align on a common definition of diversity. Diversity is the mix of differences and similarities that are both visible, for example, gender, ethnicity, age, but also invisible, such as skills, experience, and values. If we have a common definition of diversity, it's important we have a common understanding of why diversity is important. A lot of organizations will say diversity is an imperative and will give it lip service and even have a strategy, but if they lack a clear why, those strategies fall down, often because of the lack of belief, and more often than not, a lack of clear measurement. So let's take a look at why attracting and retaining diverse and inclusive teams is a business imperative. According to LinkedIn's Global Talent Trends, diverse teams are a priority because they improve culture and increase customer representation. But most importantly, 62% said it's because they advance company performance. 85% of CEOs whose organizations have a diversity and inclusion strategy say it enhances performance overall. 48% higher operating margins are generated by gender diverse management teams. Companies with executive level gender diversity had a 21% likelihood of outperforming peers. And perhaps most telling, companies with a diversity and inclusion strategy were 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So how can talent marketing help achieve your organization's broader diversity goals and help accomplish these types of results? Let's be clear, there's no silver bullet to a diversity recruitment strategy. However, understanding the role of marketing beyond simple targeting is vital. Our goal today is to create a space of learning and humility that will provide the how and drive immediate and tangible outcomes to help your organizations better develop their diversity recruitment marketing strategies. So let's meet our panel of Transformers and dive in. Thank you guys for being here. Let's do a little bit of introductions, and maybe we'll just go around the room. I'm sure you guys will introduce yourselves far better than I ever could. Maybe we'll start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. So excited to be here today. My name is Sarah Koch, and I'm the North America Talent Brand and Marketing Manager for Workday. And my responsibilities really entail of creating, executing, and optimizing our talent brand and marketing strategy to ensure that we at Workday are making the right hire for the right role at the right time. And when I'm not working out of my Seattle home office or down here at our Pleasanton headquarters, you can find me in the yoga studio or chasing the snow and sometimes the sun for a perfect day on the mountain.
I love it. Lindsay?
Hey, I'm Lindsay Sanford. I'm the Global Employer Brand Program Manager at Palo Alto Networks. I manage our candidate experience, our recruitment marketing strategies, and our employer brand from a global perspective. And it's really a unique environment that we work in because we have such a heavy talent shortage. Cybersecurity is a relatively new industry. There's not a lot of people in the industry, and we suffer certainly from a lack of diversity in our candidate pool. So we've got a lot of really difficult challenges to approach, but I'm certain that that's not unique to us. So that's why I'm here.
Welcome. Corey?
Yep, my name is Corey Boatwright, and I'm a manager on our diversity recruiting team here at LinkedIn. I manage our military recruiting programs as well as our diversity media. So our team builds programs to enable our talent acquisition teams to be more inclusive in their hiring efforts. And I'm happy to be here.
I love it. We've got the all-star cast. Well, I'm going to be asking some questions as we get into the day, but please write in with your own questions. We're going to space space at the end. We want to hear from you guys and what you're dealing with on a day-to-day. And please have the humility and vulnerability to ask questions. We recognize this is a space that everyone is learning, and so hopefully we're gonna do a little bit of that today. So let's start with the marketplace and kind of maybe take the view of hiring managers and candidates. I know according to a recent Glassdoor survey, 20% of candidates say diversity and inclusion is an enormous part of why they are making a decision to join an organization. We've talked a lot today about this inflection point that we're at. How are you guys seeing that in your day-to-day? How's it manifesting, maybe from both the candidate and hiring journeys? I'm going to start with you, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are in the era of experience, from how you order your groceries to how quickly you get your boxes delivered to your front doorstep. everything is centered around experience, and really the candidate is no different. And so candidates are really demanding more out of their careers. They're demanding more out of their recruiting experience. And so as a TA organization, we really have to react to that. They feel more empowered than ever, which has really leveled the playing field. So this change has TA organizations, and specifically us at Workday, focused on candidate motivators and developing more of a hospitality mindset around how we recruit our candidates. So really the sentiment for us is it's really less about what the candidate can do for us and more about what we can do for the candidate.
Love that. Lindsay?
I mean, I think adding on Sarah's point, a lot of what we're doing right now is moving forward and catching up with the industry of candidate experience. Like, we don't treat consumers the same way we treat candidates. But what's really important here is that most of our organizations are moving to a commitment of inclusion and diversity. The biggest challenge with that is that, 20% of people are finding this immensely important. Well, those are the 20% of the people that you really want to hire to align with your business imperatives. We want people who are intensely focused on inclusion and diversity because that's what makes your culture come to fruition. So it's not just that we're talking about a small pool of candidates. We're probably talking about a pool of candidates that are immensely important to the differences in our culture and where we want to be in the future. And that's just kind of prioritizing that along with candidate expectations and meeting them where they are as consumers as we start to model what we want to be in the future.
I love that. Corey, anything else?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is a lot of the candidates are asking more questions, not specific to their role, but specific to things that they can do outside of their role. So they're asking a lot about employee resource groups, or they're asking a lot of about how they can get involved in the community at LinkedIn. And then from a hiring perspective, we're finding that hiring managers are trying to really be more inclusive on their hiring panels to make sure that people are represented that have similar experiences as them, and also really just tying back our vision and our mission into the specific role that this candidate would be applying for.
So you're seeing hiring managers take more of the initiative from their side of the desk. That's great. Do you guys see, Lindsay, maybe start with you, a difference in terms of just regionality? And we talked a little bit earlier about the difference. Obviously, diversity can mean different places within function, or how does that manifest for you?
This is my thinking face. Sorry, I just realized how silly I looked. No, we absolutely. So we're in markets all over the world, and diversity in Europe means something entirely different to diversity in America, and you have to respect that. I think what's critical to your business imperative is that your diversity purpose, your driving objective, your driving reason behind diversity inclusion has to be the same, has to be centralized. You all have to be committed to the same thing, but you have to be flexible in how that actually appears in the different marketplaces, because that's what diversity is. It's recognizing these regional differences and celebrating these differences, and not just celebrating them, but enabling them to continue the conversation differently than someone in America might. And if you try to limit that and structure that and control what those messages are in those different regions, well, you just lost your credibility in terms of why you're focusing on inclusion in the first place.
Yeah. Corey, is it for you mentioned military and veteran affairs. Mm-hmm. We talked earlier, Doug was chatting about how important it is not to silo things out. Is that hard? I mean, you're focused on military, but that's within a broader diversity and inclusion strategy. What's that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, all of our diversity and inclusion programs are global, but just like Lindsay said, is that we have a regional focus. Because what works in, say, Asia Pacific is not going to work the same as in North America. So we're just being inclusive in regionally, but also that trickles down into our functional areas as well. So for instance, our approach is going to be much different for our engineering teams versus our non-tech teams. So you see that we're creating programs that are specific to those groups of people.
And is there overlap as you're taking the drafting behind the energy of overall diversity and inclusion efforts and then amplifying that within the military space?
Yeah, I mean, there's within the military space, there's some things that we focus on for like U.S. veterans and military folks and stuff like that, and that are applicable to other regions. But we can tweak our approach for each different region or each different group.
Got it. Okay, so if we understand the broader marketplace overall, let's start to get a little bit more tactical, start talking about planning and what an engagement strategy looks like and how those come to fruition. Sarah, maybe we'll talk with you. where does the planning process begin? How do you think about audience insights, and then how do you tap into those?
Yeah, I mean, like any strategy within the business, we work cross-functionally to make sure that we're executing not just from a talent acquisition mindset, but from what we're seeing within the business as well. So when we think about our diversity strategy, we really start with partnering with our TA leaders as well as our Chief Diversity Office. And no matter what we're doing within the business, at Workday, we have a common goal to hire and develop a diverse workforce, cultivate our employee people-first culture, invest in corporate policies, and shape the way that we're investing in underrepresented communities around the globe. So having that really centered everything we do, diversity strategy, products and technology strategy really grounds us to make sure that we're running together towards the same things. But in terms of talent, brand, and marketing and our strategy, we really, like most marketing strategies, take a full funnel content approach. So when it comes to diversity, we really like to stack the top of our funnel with awareness content as well as authentic employee stories. And then what we do from there is we A/B test to make sure that what we're putting at the top of the funnel is what the marketplace is wanting to engage with. And then we can refine the content down the funnel to be a little bit more pointed or intentional with that. We do a lot of A/B testing when it comes to our audience insights, all the way from our paid media to our job descriptions. For anybody starting out with any type of strategy or diversity strategy, I always recommend A/B testing. It's a simple way to get free audience feedback, whether intentional or unintentional, and it's a free tool, right? And then on top of that, we also have a diversity business partner that sits within talent, brand, and marketing, and their role is to really be the liaison between our employee belonging councils, as well as our Chief Diversity Office, to ensure that we, as talent marketers, are connecting the dots between what we're hearing within the marketplace and what's really going on within the business. So marrying all of these things together really allows us to keep our diversity strategy ever evolving with the business, like most strategies are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I know we were talking earlier, that notion of how do you take some of the feel-good stuff that's going on organically and then bringing that into what you're doing from a paid perspective and really doing that hard listening and having that role I love.
Yeah, I mean, having a diversity business partner on the team is incredible. I mean, that's the investment that we're making at Workday. We have a full headcount dedicated to making sure that we are finding those feel-good stories, putting them at the top of the funnel, those authentic employee stories to really who we are at Workday, and then running those testings so we can refine from there. But having someone that is fully dedicated to our employee belonging councils, our diversity office, allows us to make sure that we're really connecting the dots between, like I said, what we see within the marketplace, what's actually going on within the business, and then also marrying those feel-good things that you don't necessarily see those performance measurements from right away.
Love that.
Yeah.
It's an orchestra.
It
It's
is
an orchestra.
a
I get
beautiful
it.
orchestra.
Okay. Got it. But if nobody's listening, it doesn't maybe matter. So, I mean, how do we think about finding the right talent pools? You can do A/B testing all day long. You can get the right content. But if you're not getting the right talent pools, Lindsay, how do you think about that?
So if you look at it, because we talked a lot earlier about, not a lot, like a couple of minutes, we talked earlier about consumer expectations. And so when you look at consumer modeling and how consumer research is out there and how we do research as individuals, when you go to purchase anything, like a pair of shoes, a vacuum cleaner, an espresso machine, you don't go to the company website. You're not going to the ad that's listed at the top of the Google results. You're going to the consumer index. You're going to review sites. You're looking at Amazon reviews. We don't function similarly in the employer brand space, simply because I think we're still catching up. But the reality is, when you're looking at authenticity and where people go and how they research organizations, they're not coming to companies, they're going to individuals. That's why people care about review sites. It's why they access that kind of information when they're looking for a company, because they just don't believe us at a brand level necessarily. So when we look at talent pools, it's more that we're looking at how can we amplify the voices of our individual employees and encourage them to share within their own networks, giving them the right tools. So when we look at tools, we're saying, how can we empower their voice? How do we make them feel like they can actually write a story worth reading, which most of our employees don't feel that way. People have been told for years that they're bad writers, that they don't have stories worth telling. They think they're inherently bad writers. Our job and my team's job is really to correct that perception. It's to tell them you have a story worth telling, you have people who are listening, they're looking for your information, and we take the brand out of it.
I love that. If you think about, okay, we've got the A/B testing, the content, you started to think about the right talent pools. We're talking a lot primarily of online stuff. Corey, how do you think about complementing those strategies online and offline and what works well?
For us, I mean, as you can imagine, we leverage LinkedIn a lot. So we do a lot of our media online. And what that allows us to do is it gets our talent branding out there into the different communities and lets them know about opportunities that are at LinkedIn. And then it also allows us to engage those communities. But offline, what we're doing is we do partner with a lot of external partners, and because what we're trying to do is we're trying to build community in the areas that we're at. And those external partners allow us to do that. So we do have a strategy where we're going out using our platform, and then a more internal strategy locally so that we're building those communities.
And they work together. Okay, I love that. I think one of the things we talked about earlier, the notion of being vulnerable and having a little bit of humility, particularly, I think that's true in anything that you do, but particularly in the diversity space, that sometimes you can learn the most from your mistakes, or where maybe you made a failure and say, I wish I could have a do-over on that. I'd love to hear from you guys just of what you've learned from things that haven't worked so well and how you've implemented change. Maybe start with you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you learn the most from your mistakes and your failures. So, this isn't necessarily a failure or a mistake, but more just a lesson learned and something to keep top of mind. We recently we're really struggling for female applicants in a very male-dominant market, which I'm sure a majority of companies are struggling for within technology, right? So the theme you'll hear me talk about today, we did an A/B test. So we had looked at the job description, and we had the male hiring manager that originally wrote the job description. We kept that one, and then we brought in a diverse group of women to write a second job description. Now, some of these women had done this job before, some of them had not. So we have that perspective of really needing to know what skill set you need to be successful, as well as just women that work in the business and know what skill sets you need to be successful within the business as a whole. So we posted these two job descriptions. I mean, it's no surprise that the job description written by a diverse group of women had more female applicants. But what was more surprising to me was the fact that the applicants on that job description written by diverse women made it further down the pipeline to the interview stage than the candidates on the job description written by the male hiring manager. So nothing really groundbreaking, I would say, but it was just such a good reminder that when you're writing the job description, it's the first place where some candidates go to engage with your brand and your narrative and your voice. And I know it can really feel like an administrative task sometimes to just post the job description, then you start pipelining. But it's really imperative to get it right. So, a great place to start is just bringing in that existing talent demographic that you have within your workforce. So if it's a specific function, gender, whatever it may be, bringing them in to help with the job description goes a really, really long way. And if you don't have that existing workforce, if it's a talent that you don't have readily available, some really great tools online that you can utilize just to make sure that your job descriptions are gender inclusive and neutral. So really great place to start in terms of just making sure your job descriptions are telling the right narrative and you have that up front when they're first engaging with your brand.
What a great example of asking for help. You don't have to do it all yourself. You've got the people there to help you and invite them into the conversation. That's great. Lindsay, maybe some learnings?
I mean, I think, first of all, it's a great point because I don't have the voice of another ethnicity, right? So like when you ask for help, that really contextualizes their experience and validates their human experience, which is really important to capture from a content perspective. But I think, honestly, myself included, we are certainly tied back to metrics, and the easiest way to metric or measure something is to segment its impact in your content strategy. And that makes it clean and simple and easy to look at. But the challenge with that is that we start building these content campaigns that are inclusion and diversity focused or specific. And I think that gives us it makes it difficult for us to integrate I&D into our entire content strategy, and it runs us into siloing our I&D strategy as a whole. So when you look at content campaigns and you're trying to cleanly capture how I&D content is impacting your funnel, well, you've created this entire segment of content strategy that's not integrated into the whole brand element. So one of the mistakes that I've made in the past and I'm working to correct, obviously, is looking at integrating inclusion and diversity as a barrier to entry. Every piece that goes out, every content that we create, every story that we're trying to tell has a lens of inclusion and diversity. It's, are we being diverse? Are we being inclusive? Are we representing this in a way that's beneficial to those around us and to diverse audiences that we're looking to recruit? And it's not this separate element that would say we checked off I&D for this week, we only need one content story per week. Now, right. I get why that's appealing from a metric perspective, but I think from an authenticity and consistency perspective, you should have it everywhere.
That's great. Corey?
So very similar thing that we've learned along the way is not to build things in silos. So in our recruiting programs, what we were doing is we were building diversity recruiting programs, and then we were adding them to our recruiting processes. And just that the fact of adding it to our recruiting processes just made some inefficiencies. So what we learned along the way is to reset how our processes and build diversity recruiting throughout. It's just simply how we recruit. It's not necessarily diversity recruiting. It's just recruiting in an inclusive way.
Right. You were talking earlier, and you mentioned the idea of partners. I feel like some people say, okay, great, I can't do this. That's good, I can ask for help.
Sure.
You were talking a little bit earlier about asking for help and maybe having too much help from outside partners. How do you think about partners that can really help you move things forward?
There's a lot of external partners out there that are doing great work, and it very quickly can get overwhelming. We wanted to partner with as many folks as we could because we were interested in what they were doing, but what we learned is that we weren't building meaningful relationships with each one of those partners just because simply we just didn't have the capacity to do it. So we were hosting a ton of events, but really what we found is that if we just narrowed that scope down a little bit to some more key partners and then build deep relationships with them, we're able to really start to build that sense of community.
That's terrific. Okay, so we've talked the marketplace, we've talked about thinking about our planning. Arguably the most important is talking about how we measure things. I think if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't matter necessarily. And as I've talked to people who wrestle with how to approach diversity, if they don't have clear KPIs and clear success metrics, then it can just be a thing. Yep, I'm gonna talk about it, and it feels good to talk about it. So how do you guys see the conversation around measurement evolving, and how are you holding your stakeholders accountable? I think, Sarah, you might want to have some perspective.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of accountability, we are very, very fortunate at Workday to have it really start from the top down. Our CEO, Neil, has made incredible investments into our diversity strategy and takes it really seriously in return. So, that also helps our employees understand the why behind it, helps shape our narrative within the market. And just having an executive team behind your diversity strategy and keeping it top of mind every company meeting, every email, along with all of our other initiatives, to Lindsay's point, it has to have a seat at the table. So having that is really great. But, when it comes to the hard metrics, I'm a data person. If I can't measure performance, that's usually a good indicator to me that it's not something that's really going to move the needle or that I should be investing a ton of time or manpower into. So that's just a simple way for me to think about, is this project or this piece of content going to measure, right? Some of the other measurements are also Grace Hopper, Lesbians Who Tech, Dev Color, some of these bigger events that we sponsor, the partnerships that we take part in. And then, of course, just general marketing metrics, right? So we follow lead generation, pipelining, click-through rates, in-mail open and acceptance rates. And then we also are able to focus on our proactive recruiting strategies to see where diverse candidates are actually falling out of the pipeline. I think someone said it earlier, leaky pipeline. Yeah. To follow the data back to that point, to understand the why and be able to shape our strategy around that. We also use some really great tools at LinkedIn to help us get our diversity content out in the marketplace. So Elevate is a really incredible tool for us. It allows us to share our authentic employee stories, third-party content, an easy place for our employees to go in and share that content. And it also gives us insight into the analytics function to see what the marketplace is engaging with, as well as what our employees want to see from us within talent branding. So lots of great tools at LinkedIn that can kind of help optimize your strategy and help you measure along the way.
Again, layering.
Yes.
Not one thing, you're not just targeting. Got it. I got it. Okay, I'm learning. When you think about your attraction strategy connecting to hiring demand and recruiting effort, how are you seeing people who are on the front lines, recruiters, how are they getting more involved in the pull through, and what does that look like in terms of them holding themselves accountable to measurement?
That's a good question. No, I think when we look at attraction strategy and how it connects to the bottom line, I think that the reality is the only way you have a successful program is if the people throughout your organization are implementing it. I think leadership commitment is paramount, but I think in terms of where that trust and that relationship comes through, it's recruiters, right? They're the ones who are on, I guess, the front line, so to speak, and they're interacting with the public and interacting with the candidates, and they're the ones who actually believed from an authenticity perspective. We reference, I talk about trust a lot in terms of our strategies and where that generates and how that's communicated, and we rely heavily on Edelman's trust barometer and how we look at different measurements of trust and where people rely on other people and believe other people and how that trust is developed as a relationship. And I always come back to the fact that it's not organizational trust, it's individuals. It's academic experts, technical experts, and it's people who we think are similar to ourselves. So as soon as you start to develop this relationship with someone, they start to see themselves in the other person, and as soon as that connection is established, they're much more likely to believe them, to buy in, to adopt, to connect, and to build a relationship. So when I talk to our recruiters, and the way that we see them becoming more involved in that, first you validate them. You say, hey, without you, this won't happen. Right. And without you communicating and sharing your story, this connection just would never appear. And it's just this reality that at this point in time, diversity strategies are table stakes, legally, like we have to adhere to certain strategies. And I think the biggest difference is how that becomes a tangible reality for our candidates and for our recruiters and for our organizations. It's how we make it come to life. Right. And, speaking of vulnerability, no one has the answer, and we're still figuring it out. And I think that's a big differentiator, is to make that vulnerability known. And seek help where you can. And that can be all the way down to your recruiters and telling your recruiters it's okay to communicate that we don't have all the answers, and that's why we're hiring different people to find them. But we really focus on leveraging the individual and helping the recruiters understand the power of their voice and how that can communicate a relationship to candidates that they authentically buy into. So.
I think also to your point too, like the transparency that comes along with that. Like when we talk about the marketplace and what candidates want, they want that transparency. So when you're talking about being honest about what you necessarily are working towards or don't have, candidates really appreciate that honesty and transparency.
I think it's why more companies are publishing their diversity numbers, right? Yep. Like no one's hiding. Not no one, obviously. A lot of people aren't hiding that information anymore because they think that when you admit that there's a problem, like that's the first step to correcting it. So the more open you are about, cybersecurity is tough. It's a new industry. We don't have a ton of professionals. It's an insanely difficult industry to work in. And so we just have to be honest with ourselves and with our organization and meet them with humility and find answers together. So totally.
That's terrific. So going to the other end of the spectrum in terms of thinking about the hiring manager, how are you holding hiring managers accountable on your side of the fence?
Well, I think similar to what Sarah was saying is that it's really top down. So this starts at our CEO and then it permeates through our organization. So people are aware that this is like the highest of priority for the organization. And then what we learned is like along the way is when we're building these programs, we're building it with our stakeholders. We're building it with our hiring managers so that we can build it. Programs and processes that are helpful to them as well. So what it comes to is that we're all in it together and we won't let each other fail.
So if that idea of not failing and thinking about success, I think this will maybe be the last question we ask the panel, and then we'll go to some of what we're seeing online. So please keep chiming in with those questions. If we challenge ourselves to how you measure your own success, and if people are saying, okay, what can I do in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Love to hear from each of you guys how you define success for yourself as an individual and maybe for your broader organization. Corey, you want to start?
Sure. Definitely we're looking at representation throughout the funnel is one way that we measure it. Retention is a big component of that. But also it's just like really thing that we haven't really discussed yet is this notion of belonging and just taking like the pulse on our employees that are here and just how do they feel when they come in the doors? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can bring their whole selves to work? Do they feel like they can show up in a meeting? And really, if people feel like they belong in our organization, then I think we're successful.
Well, otherwise it's just a turnstile, right? If we get all the people at the door and then they're leaving in 6 months, it doesn't matter, right? Okay. Lindsay?
I think diversity doesn't happen overnight. No one's answered this question. That's why we're here today in terms of like why we're committed to this and making changes. So I'm really focused on progressional metrics, like measuring progress as you make your way through this challenge of diversity. So that means looking a lot at pipelines. So have we generated new leads? Are we engaging diversity audiences? Are we generating pipeline? Are we adding new campaigns? Are we engaging the audience that we have? And all of those different touch points have different metrics. So it's looking at your click-through rates, your growth of your community, volume of candidates in those communities, where they are at the progress of the workflow, and how they're making progression through the workflow stages. But it's giving those smaller successes that I think keeps people engaged, because the end goal is retention and hiring and belonging. But that's really hard. And so what we look at doing too is giving them smaller successes and smaller wins so that people feel they can celebrate the small wins over and over again, and then it becomes second nature, and then they become excited for the next big thing. So I think it's really important to have those intermediary metrics that really help people buy into the process and celebrate small successes, because shooting for the moon is phenomenal, but if you haven't made it out of the atmosphere, it feels kind of like you're never going to get there. So.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all of the same metrics that everyone highlighted on the panel today, retention and hires, but taking a different approach to it. Like, success for me also comes from those authentic employee stories around belonging and diversity within the business organically come to us, right? As talent brand and marketers, we can create content every single day. We have our editorial calendars, but having the employees come to us and say, I want to tell this story, and having an organic pipeline of content means that it's happening within the business, right? So regardless of the retention and hires, we're always counting those metrics. Having the business come to us and share their authentic employee stories means that we're moving the needle within the business, and being proactive with our employee stories versus picking certain people to ask them to tell their stories.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
So just synthesizing some of that, I hear you guys. There's going to be short-term tangible metrics. We have to win on those. And then there's going to be less tangible metrics that are happening over time. So patience and the ability to be able to move short-term, but also long-term, so that you've got to start to feel, okay, it's happening organically, coupled with what you're doing from a numbers perspective. Amazing. I feel like I could ask you guys questions all day. There are some really great ones from the feed. And I particularly love this one. So diversity can be a very touchy subject. What cross-functional relationships do you have to ensure everything you're putting out there is sensitive, inclusive, and sound? Maybe, Sarah, you want to take that because you talked a little bit about your content strategy? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, like I said earlier, we're so fortunate to have a dedicated headcount within talent, brand, and marketing that's our diversity business partner. So their role, quite literally, is to have that diversity and inclusive lens on every piece of content, every event, every template, everything that we do. So we're really fortunate enough to have that person dedicated to making sure that those sensitive topics, picking apart one tiny word on is it feminine or masculine, we were talking about this earlier, and making sure that we have that inclusive lens on everything we do. Like I mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of really great free tools online to make sure that your job descriptions are gender inclusive and gender neutral. So I would say it's a good mix between utilizing our diversity business partner, and if you don't have that headcount, which I'm sure a lot of teams don't, having someone that is passionate about this topic, act as that liaison between the talent, brand, and marketing team and employee belonging councils or chief diversity officer is a huge help. Like I said, it really connects the dots between what we're doing and what's happening within the business. And then also utilizing some of those free tools or paid tools as well to make sure that your content is inclusive.
And being, I hear you saying, really acute listening. So you put those things out there, and then you're listening in real time and being able to optimize and change as you go.
It's a constant measurement to optimize, right? If you put a static piece of content out and you just let it perform and you're not reporting on it, you're not really doing yourself or the business any favors. So constantly staying on top of your metrics and seeing how things are performing allow you to optimize from there. Okay. Yeah.
A lot of good questions on the measurement piece of things, and maybe I'll pull these two together, but how do you determine your measurement strategy, and who do you loop in during that process? And then a follow-on to that is, how often do you revisit KPIs?
I mean, from a measurement perspective, I get literally as many people involved as possible, because especially from a candidate experience, it's such a cross-functional experience. What we actually started to do is we defined every touch point within a recruitment process that a candidate could potentially come across. And that means starting all the way at the beginning of the funnel. So we're talking awareness. How did they find us? Where did they learn about us? What channels did they use? What metrics are existing in those channels? So we went all the way from awareness to engagement to application to candidate to interview to offer reject, offer hire. And it ended up being like 180 touch points, something insanely ridiculous. But we tied metrics back to each of those portions, and then we started to prioritize different sections based on how much of an impact we were having and where we were starting to see people drop off. But from a metric perspective, especially in digital environments and social media and just metrics in general, it's not a science experiment. There's no case, like there's no constant. One day you might release a story that would indicate that you're heavily diverse, but maybe it came out in the same day where national news coverage amplified your message. And so we don't, like, none of this exists in a vacuum. And I say all that to say that when you're testing metrics and defining KPIs, you have to revisit those metrics at least on a 3-month basis, because things change so constantly, and it's just not a science experiment. There's no control group. So it's really difficult to say, like, this is it and this is how it will always be, because that's just frankly not how things happen.
That's right. And or understanding the broader ecosystem of what's going on. I love that point. Yeah, so what's my message within the context of macro themes? Well, maybe last question, which I think everyone can answer, and just from ending in a spirit of learning and always getting better. We are here for one day. This is a moment in time that I've heard all throughout. We are going to continue to make sure that you have to commit to learning and committing to getting better. How do you guys think about learning in and around the diversity and inclusion space? And maybe even if there's some tangible takeaways in terms of trends or trades that you guys read on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I mean, I always like the terminology of being a lifelong learner, whether it's diversity-related products and technology, like everything in life, you should be a lifelong learner. That's what allows you to be successful and stay on top of trends. But for me, I mean, shameless plug, LinkedIn always has great content. That Elevate tool also pulls in a lot of third-party content. All of the other places too, everyone subscribes to their favorite news. I have one that comes to my inbox every morning, and specifically within diversity, working closely with our diversity office, searching trends on Twitter. I mean, it's really how you choose to best consume your news. But LinkedIn is a great place you can refine some of the content in your feeds if you're more focused on diversity-related content, and it's a great place where it curates for you, and you can go in and just easily digest what you'd like. Yeah.
For me, learning is all about managing my assumptions and working through discomfort. I think that it's a very uncomfortable experience to feel like you don't have the answers. And I think a lot of companies, myself included, and individuals don't. So when I look at learning, I find ways to make myself uncomfortable, and I insert myself into those conversations as often as possible. And that means talking intently with people who sit in these positions, who fit those different demographics, and really getting to know them. So that's really one aspect of it. And then managing the assumptions that I make as a result of those conversations. So that unconscious bias that was spoken to earlier, making sure I'm not having those, or at least you always have unconscious bias. It's acknowledging what they are and bringing it to the forefront and then working through those. But I really like to push myself to discomfort, and that means that we really need to push ourselves to have transparent, authentic, uncomfortable conversations that make us talk about difficult topics. And without those difficult topics, I feel like we don't learn anything worth knowing. So that's really my approach to learning is talking to people that have completely different perspectives from my own.
I love that.
I think there's a few ways that I approach it. One, I use LinkedIn Learning a lot. I live on LinkedIn Learning, so that anything that I can that I'm trying to upskill on, definitely I search there first. Second, our teams generally, even my immediate team and then teams that we work very closely with, we often share a lot of articles and stuff like that back and forth. That really helps keep everybody engaged, and I find a lot of value out of that. And the last thing is just asking our cross-functional partners, like our people analytics teams, to learn more about what they're seeing and understanding just their perspective on how to approach this topic. So just working cross-functionally too has been very helpful.
Great lessons. I think what I hear in each of those is getting out of your comfort zone. And I know our Chief Diversity Officer talks a lot about getting out of the own networks, even on LinkedIn, right? Mm-hmm. You're talking to a lot of people that look like you and that have similar backgrounds to you. So how do you push yourself to ask somebody for a different perspective and a different opinion? And I love what you said, Lindsay, that notion of, I want to make myself uncomfortable. And if I can feel it in my stomach and I know that, like, I'm not sure, like, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And invite ourselves to be uncomfortable and really push towards change. That's the only way we're going to help transform things.